y'all, to Burnout Bestie Peter here with the Millennial Reset. And on today's episode, we are focused on a topic that I absolutely love talking about. But I'm also glad that we have a licensed clinical psychologist with us today to help us make a little bit more sense of it. Healing generational trauma. You know, we all know that one person in their 30s and 40s that is going through it. They are on a healing journey to break the generational patterns that have gone on for far too long. And they said, nope, the buck stops with me. I'm not going to let this toxicity get passed down any further, right? I'm not letting my worth be defined by my accomplishments or lack thereof. I'm not letting my children grow up thinking that they aren't enough for being exactly who they are and nothing else. I don't know. Maybe that person is you. Maybe it's someone that you know and love that's dear to you. And if it's somebody else, you might look at it and you might say, "Oh gosh, they're really going through it." It might look ugly sometimes, right? Because it is. It is. It's a brutal responsibility to take on to break the chain. But let me tell you, besties, damn, is it worth it? Because I truly believe this from the bottom of my heart that this is our legacy as a generation. You know, we might not have the quote unquote old American dream, but we are creating the new American dream. And it has nothing to do with being American and everything to do with being a human.
Mm.
We might not have the affordable housing. So instead, we're focused on our inner housing. You see what I did?
Mm.
And
Preach, Peter.
for me, what that means is finally taking care of myself like I deserve after decades of neglecting myself. Like dealing with built up trauma in my nervous system that has not only been suppressed in me, but also everyone else before me that never dealt with it. And, you know, for those of you that are on this journey, maybe you sit with your parents and you talk to them and they're like, but we didn't cause you any trauma. And the old you would have sat there and argued with them and tried to get them to realize something that the new you fully understands, that this goes back further than just one generation. And your parents have just been unconscious to it their whole lives. And now it's hardwired. So you can't really blame them. So the new you just give them a hug and you allow them to have your perceptions and them to have their perceptions. And instead of focusing on resentfulness, instead, you do the inner work. You begin stripping away the conditioning that you become awakened to that is holding you back from being the most badass, truest expression of yourself. Because that's what the world needs more of right now. Real people who are doing the real work of being a real human. So, for all of you millennials out there that are either in this journey right now, or you are wondering if maybe you're just now becoming conscious of all this for the first time, this episode is for you. We are having real talk today about breaking generational trauma. It's a celebration to those that are stepping up to the plate to break old cycles and create new ones. It is a celebration of those that know it's not their fault, but they're willing to take responsibility anyways. And it's a celebration of the millions of millennials that know for real change to happen in our external world, it starts with a change on the inside. The
Mhm.
tough inner work of deconditioning, of reprogramming, and healing. And again, thank goodness that we are joined by one of our mental health besties, licensed clinical psychologist, contributor to Good Morning America, and we'll talk more about this at the end. But my favorite new author, she's going to talk to us about her book, which is completely amazing. Dr. Abina Berry, welcome back, my friend.
Thank you, Peter. That was a fabulous intro. I'm just like, "Ooh, this is like preaching. Come on, bring it."
I
This is
just
the church of self-work.
I just had something to say about it, dag nabbit.
I love it. I love it. That was everything you said was so spot on and important, especially just this piece of like inner work needs to happen because we are the world. So yes,
Yup,
absolutely.
indeed.
Yeah.
Dr. Barry, I've got 1,000 different questions for you today, but obviously we only have a short period of time. But before we dive into some questions here about, like, how do we understand this? Where do we begin? Tell the viewers that did
Yeah.
not get a chance to listen to your first episode that we did together. Tell a little about you, your background in psychology, and kind of what you're doing today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Peter stated, I am Dr. Bina Berry. My love for psychology and understanding the brain and human behavior and emotion goes all the way back to my childhood, actually, because that I got attracted to trying to understand these things. Actually, due to my own trauma, right? And wanting to understand humans so that I could break patterns. 8-year-old me was already on that mission before I even understood what that mission was, which is very cool and interesting. And then now fast forward to this place that I'm at in my career. So I primarily work in private practice right now, working with mostly individuals, but I'm trained as a generalist. So I do couples therapy, family therapy, and individual, of course. And some of the things that I focus on most of the time with presenting concerns is definitely identity work, helping people strip themselves of conditioning, trauma responses to figure out who they are authentically. That's something I'm really passionate about. Um, Trauma work, of course, because every person who comes to therapy, that is part of the work that we do because we all have trauma of some kind. Even if you don't think you do, you definitely do.
Yeah.
So there's definitely that as well. And I also help with mood disorders, working with individuals who are neurodivergent. Um, Also things like schizophrenia, psychosis, again, like very broad. I do a
Yeah.
I work with a lot of different individuals and people from all different kinds of backgrounds and love what I do. And also occasionally I do psychological and neurological assessment as well, but I'm doing less of that right now because I'm working mostly remotely
Yeah.
because it's
Yeah, and for those of you that are wondering, the way that I found out about Dr. Barry is that she was on TikTok Live, and I'm telling y'all, I get comments sometimes where it's like, "Oh my gosh, Peter, you explained that in the way that, like, I couldn't have explained it myself." If you think that about me, go watch Dr. Barry, because when she gets on TikTok Live, it's just like she's channeling. She is in a channeling mode, and the way that she explains things about how to heal trauma and how to understand your mind better, it just makes so much sense. So highly recommend that you go check her out. We'll obviously post that on the episode links as well. But get ready, y'all, because we're about to get some free therapy today.
yes.
Yes, with Dr. Barry. Let's start here, Dr. Barry. Before we dive into, like, the how and, like, what do we
Yeah.
do about it? We hear a lot about, like, generational trauma all the time, especially unfortunately from people that maybe not are the ones that should be talking about it as much. And so let's start there. Like, what does it mean when we say generational trauma? Like, how does that work? And let's even go down, let's start high level, and then, like, let's get into the nitty gritty. But let's start high level first. Like, what does it mean when we talk about generational trauma?
Yeah. So and whenever anything significant, especially like a negative kind of experience happens for humans, especially if it affects groups of people, right? Then that is going to have some lasting effects that then humans have to recover from. So for instance, we are still absolutely recovering from the traumas of slavery and segregation, right? So that's an example of like something occurs for a period of time that is horrific and horrible, and we are then having to do a lot of unlearning and cleanup and healing, and that goes on for a while, as you can see,
Yeah.
right? It's been decades and we still have more work to do. A lot of that too is because it's harder than it should be to help people update their mindsets and their beliefs. And a big part of it is that the average human has never been educated on how their brain works. So
Amen.
they don't know when they're engaging in problematic patterns that science has long discovered, labeled, told us like what it is, what to do if it's happening to correct it. So like one of the big things that gets in the way of our growth is confirmation bias, right?
Mm,
People are conditioned to think a certain way. They experience cognitive dissonance when you present evidence to them like, hey, that this is why this is harmful or inaccurate. Here's the brain imaging that shows you that, beating on your kids is harming them psychologically. Like you can literally see their brain changing. But like
yeah.
people are resistant because they feel uncomfortable. And they're like, well, this discomfort must mean that I need to defend this belief, because they don't actually understand. No, the discomfort means that you're being presented with something that you need to actually listen to, analyze, and decide whether or not you need to update your beliefs. But you'd have to be educated on psychology to even know what cognitive dissonance is and how to handle it appropriately. And most people aren't. They experience it, they get upset, they get defensive,
Yeah.
and it delays our growth. Because ideally, it shouldn't take, you know, 3 generations or whatever for us to like recover from something. If we were all educated on our mental
Yeah.
health, we could do it a lot more efficiently and quicker as a species.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. So much to unpack here. But let's go back to kind of like the, I guess, the passing down of trauma, right? Or those,
Yes.
that mindset, that belief, that way of, excuse me, that way of operating. Talk to us a little bit about like, let's dig into the nitty gritty here, like scientific stuff, right? With like genetics. How does, my grandmother being an alcoholic present itself in my genetics in any way?
So the truth is, like, we know that genetics play a role, but it is kind of hard to determine like how big of a role, I guess. Because here's the
Yeah.
thing: the way you think about it is, let's say, using the example you just gave, your grandmother struggled with alcoholism, and now, yes, we would say there is, genetic susceptibility to that, right, for you.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, how do you pull apart whether or not, like, let's say, fast forward, you do end up struggling with alcoholism? How do we know that that is mostly genetic versus like you just growing up around people abusing alcohol and
Yeah.
learning that behavior? And it's kind of hard to pull it apart. I personally believe, from what the research that I have done and what we have in terms of up-to-date facts about how all this works, that yes, of course, nature plays a role, right? Genetic
Yeah.
susceptibility is a thing. But I like to always say that genetics and our susceptibility is like, okay, here's a light switch. So if I have a family history of alcoholism, I now have a light switch that is called alcoholism. I come into the world, that light switch is turned off, right? When I come into the world. But the
Mm-hmm.
experiences that I have throughout my upbringing, even within adulthood, just my lived experiences, the traumas I endure, all that stuff, that I believe is what decides whether or not that light switch gets turned on. So the
Mm.
good news is you're not doomed to struggle with alcoholism just because you have a family history of alcoholism.
Yeah.
But if there are, severe traumas and experiences that, pull you in the wrong direction, it increases the likelihood of then you maybe having a similar problem as well. But when you think about it, it's like, well, you had a high chance of that because you're growing up in a home with adults who don't know how to cope, and
Yeah.
they're what are they modeling for you? When you don't know how to cope with big emotions, you use substances. So then
Yeah.
that's what you're being taught. Even if nobody sits you down and says, like, when I have big emotions, I drink excessively because I don't know how to cope. They don't have to sit you down. They're modeling that. And we as human beings are very observant, and we learn from what we see. So I personally believe, in the science support this as well strongly, that the experiences you have is really the thing that matters the most.
Yeah.
It truly is. Genetics,
Mm-hmm.
yes, is important, but when it comes to the mental health stuff, it's really more so about, like, how were you raised? What did you see? What was explained to you or not? What skills were you taught or not? That is what's going to make, the biggest difference in your overall well-being.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it just makes more sense. Thank you for that explanation, because I think that was super helpful even for myself. Is like, it's not even necessarily about the physical DNA of that genetic. It's about how that shows up for somebody when they are behaving as a human being, like you mentioned, right? So it's like it's the way I almost like to think about it is it's like it's the coping mechanism that gets passed down, and you have to kind of
Yes,
become
yes,
aware of that to say, oh yeah, everybody else so far in my past has used alcohol or drugs or whatever it may be to cope with XYZ. And that's where I think that's the first step, at least, for me, is like the awareness part is oftentimes the hardest part of being able to nail
yes.
that down for yourself of, oh shit, here I am falling into the same behaviors and coping patterns that have been unconscious to my mother, to my father, to everybody before me. And
Mhm.
that, it sounds like, where we begin to break that chain, right? As opposed to just like, yeah,
Absolutely.
trying to change something inside
Absolutely.
of ourselves.
Because it's in the subconscious. So you have
Yeah,
to, if you tell yourself, well, I'm just not going to end up like that, like that's great. You can say that, but it's
yeah,
like, what are you doing though to make sure of that? You have to have a different plan and approach to caring for yourself than the people around you, because then you are going to be more likely to engage in that. So many people declare verbally that they're not going to be like their parents, their whatever, but then end up being exactly like that because they think
yeah,
the declaration is what's going to protect them. The declaration is the first step and the
yeah,
easiest. It's all
yeah,
actions and do you seek help? Do you whatever it may be? And I think people get confused too. And I get it. Like, I get why this is confusing, because there are certain things that when we talk about genetics, it's like, oh, it's a really big deal. Like, for instance, your eye color. It's like
hmm,
genetics play, has the biggest role in that.
right,
Like, not necessarily your environment or whatever, like that's what's going to affect that. So I think people get confused because there are certain things about us that are going to be largely, if not completely, determined by genetics. Mental health is different though. So
mm,
there are some things, like being neurodivergent for instance, that yes are going to be bigger determining factor for genetics, right? It's
yeah,
like, oh, you have a family history of autism. Maybe both parents are on the spectrum. Your odds of being on the spectrum are going to be somewhere close to like 70%,
yeah,
right? So, like, yeah, yes, with autism.
yeah,
However, when we're talking about behaviors, talking about substance abuse behaviors, or we're talking about anger management or something like that, that is going to depend more on your nurture than it
yeah,
will nature, and that's good. That
yeah,
should be good news. I hope people can see why that's good news, because it's like, then that means we can stop these patterns that we're seeing by us just taking mental health more seriously and no longer like winging parenting, and actually being like, if I want to understand how to raise a human, I have to study humans, right?
yeah,
Because we can't
hmm,
say that we don't have this knowledge, because we do.
yeah. So there you go. For all the millennials that have that, special kind of millennial anxiety that we all have, right? It's like the anxiety might, obviously there's a shit ton happening in our world that's going to cause anxiety anyways, but like
Yes.
anxiety can by all means be one of those things that's passed down genetically. How you cope with that anxiety is where you begin to break that generational trauma pattern, whether or
You
not
got
you
it.
rely on the easy path to, go to all of the solutions that everybody else did before you that created those toxic patterns, or you say, oh, I've uncovered something really special here, and now it's time to do the inner work. And that's obviously where therapy can come into play, right? A therapist is able to
Yes.
really help you to uncover what might be so subconscious or even unconscious to us. So that's what I want to talk about next with you, Dr. Barry, is like,
Mm-hmm.
because I think so often, again, the hardest part is just becoming aware of it and fully aware of it in the first place. And so
Mm-hmm.
before that happens, though, what might be like some of the signs that we can kind of look for in ourselves, like when that stored generational trauma kind of builds up and begins to present itself to others in our outside world, and maybe we're not as conscious of it as first, but like, are there ways that maybe we can become maybe more conscious of our subconscious behaviors?
Yes. Yeah. So definitely just free writing or free talking helps. So like if people don't like journaling, that's okay. I do recommend maybe sometimes recording yourself if you do the free talking, just so you have a way to reference back to it.
Yeah.
But when you allow yourself to just process and let your words go wherever they go, and you ask yourself questions from a place of curiosity instead of a place of judgment, you
Mm,
can tap into subconscious mind. Of course, also meditating and things like that can help as well. You also need to just honestly analyze and reflect about your life, like you just
yeah.
do, and you more than likely will need help to do that, because that's why people like myself exist. We studied psychology and human behavior and emotion and thought for 10, if you're a psychologist, it's like 10 years of college and 4 residencies, right? There's a
Yeah.
reason why it takes so long, because there's so much to learn, and then there's still more to learn after that, which is why we have to do continual education credits even after we're
Yeah.
licensed. So it's like you need help, because you're going to have biases, you're going to have blind spots, but you really do have to work on analyzing really what happened. And you use the example of anxiety, which I love, because one, we all have anxiety. It's an emotion. A lot of people don't know that because they've just
Yeah.
struggled with it for so long that they almost view it as a disorder always, right? Like just the experience of it. And it's like,
Hmm.
yes, anxiety disorders are a thing, but anxiety is first an emotion before it's anything else. You
Yeah.
develop a disorder because you maybe were not taught emotional regulation skills. Because your parents, if they don't know how to do that, they can't teach you it. No different than if your parent doesn't speak French, they can't teach you French. So you have to be able to analyze your life and say, what did my parents actually know and what knowledge did they have to instill in me so that you can identify what gaps exist and just observe your own behaviors, observe
Yeah.
how you respond to your own emotions, right? And look at it with again
Yeah.
a curious eye, not a judgmental eye, because if you're too judgmental of yourself, it'll breed like high levels of shame that aren't always. Shame can be and has its place. It is a emotion that has an important role. However, it sometimes can be come up in at times it shouldn't because of trauma for people,
Yeah.
right? And that's what we call toxic shame. So you want to be careful about that. You just want to analyze and say, okay, what did they actually teach me and what didn't they teach me? And that includes anybody who was around you growing up. And what did they teach me that maybe I shouldn't have been taught, that too, so that you
Yeah.
can start unlearning.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day because, I'm one of those people where it's like when I kind of started this journey in my mid 30s, I was like, where is this coming from? Like, where am I was aware of the behavioral patterns, but I was just trying to figure out like where does that stem from? And obviously
Yes,
therapy helped a lot with that. But like one of the other things that I did just kind of as my own little like self-help journey is and I realize not everybody has this as like an opportunity based on like how our parents photographed and documented our childhood or whatever. But like, luckily, I had like a pretty big pile of like pictures throughout all my childhood and like all the way back to going to a baby. And like, I just started going through them. And because
I
I
love
think
that.
what happens is like you forget about so much of that. Um,
Mhm.
as children, right? It's like if we experience trauma, especially big T trauma, it just gets sometimes we forget about it because our body's like, well, I'm not prepared to make sense of that yet. I don't know how to make sense of that yet. So it just gets stored up in the body. And then later down in your life, you're like, oh my gosh, I've got all this built up trauma, but I don't know where it comes from. And for me, at least, like that was such a huge piece of like being able to remember 5-year-old me and 10-year-old me again because that's part of that tough inner work, like you mentioned, Dr. Berry, of going back and being able to identify all of those events from your past and where it may have come from originally, of even being able to remember that in the first place is, I think, one of the biggest challenges. So if you've got old videos of yourself, if you've got old pictures of yourself, like go
That
back.
can be very helpful.
And yeah,
Hmm.
I love what you
And
said
also
too
just
about,
look at your parents now. If
yeah,
they haven't grown very much as people, you can see what they know or don't know, even right
yeah,
now. So, like,
yeah,
you're limited in those resources of videos or pictures or whatever. Ask yourself, okay, have my parents really been working on themselves in the
yeah,
past 30? If you're 30 and you're like, have they really been working on themselves in the past 30 years? The answer is like no, and they're pretty much the same. Just
yeah,
observe them now and then be like, man, how would they have been reacting or responding to me as a child based on how they act today?
yeah.
Like, yeah,
And yeah, I mean, I love what you said about getting curious versus getting judgmental because I think that
yes.
can be such an easy place to go to, especially when you're analyzing your parents and their behaviors, is to come from it from that place of judgment as opposed to just getting, setting judgment aside. Yes, there's a time and a place for those feelings to be had, right? Around like the resentment, the anger, right? All of those are completely acceptable and are part of the process. But after that, after you feel that all out, then being able to just get really curious about it and coming at it from more of kind of an objective, logical point of view, so that not so that you can, fix it, quote unquote, but just so that you can at least become more aware of it, so that you can take action as opposed to, a reaction is kind of how I like to think about it.
Yes, and you're
Um,
absolutely right. Yeah, processing allows us to move from one to the other. So
yeah.
yes, absolutely.
So let's
Hmm.
dive into that piece, right? Let's start
Hmm.
talking about like the how piece. Obviously, like we mentioned, if you have the resources to go see a therapist, like please go do it for yourself. Like it's one of the best things you will ever do. But for those that don't have that as an option, several different reasons why, I'm sure, right? But like,
Yes.
what are some ways that we can not only become more aware of our subconscious patterns on our own, but also like what are some of those ways that we can quote unquote reparent ourselves in order to break that chain? Because obviously, I'm sure that's all we could do a whole other episode on that. But like, what are just a few tips that you would say to help us to be able to, again, not only become more aware of it, but to then begin to reframe it and shift that pattern?
Hmm. So the first thing I want to say is one of the harder things for people, which is you have to be willing to accept or get to a place of acceptance that a lot of the common beliefs that have been passed down and perpetuated from generation to generation about humans or how they should be or act are false. And that can be
Hmm.
very hard,
Oh yeah.
right? That can be very, very, very hard for people to receive. Right? Like a easy example of that, right, is often me having to explain to people that, for instance, people with, men with little boys that have XY chromosomes, they are just as capable of any other human of learning emotional intelligence, empathy, all of that. But it's people's beliefs that
Yeah.
cause them to fail to nurture their child's emotional and mental health. So then they have the audacity that when that child is 18 or 20 to say, I have no idea how he turned out this way. I have
Yeah.
no idea how he lacked all this empathy and like, why does he talk to me like that? It's like, well, you had 18 years to teach him these skills and you didn't. You
Mm,
did it because you believe the nonsense that like he's incapable of that. But it's just not true. And if you spend any time around young children, you will. I can get into the science of it and I will in a second, but like just be around young children.
yeah.
Spend 2 seconds around a 1 year old of regardless of sex or gender, and they are literally going to all act exactly the same. And you want to know why? Because we all have the same structures and parts to our brain. So we are all capable of learning these things, but if people believe enough that they weren't capable of it, it changes how you then react and respond to them. Psychology has shown that time and time again. Even in my book, chapter 7 is on self-fulfilling prophecies and teaching people the power of their beliefs. And the quote that I have for that chapter is, if you believe something enough, then you can make it come true, but that's not always a good thing.
Yeah.
um
Oh, I love
so
that.
so it's people don't understand the power of beliefs and the brainwashing that has happened. And it's like a lot of these beliefs are, we got to remember where they come from. They come from many, 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 many years ago where people didn't know better at the time.
Yeah.
But we know better now. Science has advanced. We can now literally image people's brains. We know all the parts of the brain, and again, we all have the same parts, so that means we're all capable of learning these things.
Hmm.
Right? And it's also like you got to break out of thinking that just because somebody has XX chromosomes, then they're going to be nurturing. I have plenty of clients, unfortunately, that grew up with mothers who were far from nurturing, to say the least. There was nothing
Yeah.
about your sex chromosomes that make you anything. You're either nurturing or empathetic or emotionally intelligent based on, were you taught those things? If
Hmm.
the answer is no, then you will not be those things. If
Yeah.
the answer is yes, then you will be those. It's that simple, right?
Yeah.
So it's overcomplicated. So people have to be willing to release themselves of this inaccurate knowledge. Like, I don't even want to call it like just nonsense. It's just nonsense. It's
It's
just
a
wrong.
perception. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a perception that we just scientifically have disproven
Yeah.
at this point. So that's the first thing. You have to be willing to allow your reality to be like significantly altered and saying like,
Uh-huh.
oh my gosh, these patterns are not actually due to biology. They're due to the conditioning of us believing these things and then doing it to person after person after person. That's
Yeah.
what's causing these patterns. And I do talk about that in the book as well. So that's the first thing. Are you willing to like release yourself of your current understanding of the world and actually educate yourself on our understanding of the world now based in science, biology, the up-to-date facts, right?
Yeah. It's
That will
almost
really
like
help the healing.
it almost sounds like this first part that you're talking about is like you really have to kind of understand that like, 200 years ago or whatever, some group of guys got together and said, "Hey, this is the way that we should do things." And then they told all their friends, and all their friends latched onto it and said, yeah, that sounds like a good way of doing things. Y'all, truth is simply a perception of truth. And I think that's
Yes.
Dr. Barry, like that. I guess if we were to sum it up in like one sentence, but like for me at least, it was like when I began this journey, I thought that I had to become a different person. I thought that I had to become this like completely new version of myself, when the reality of it is it had nothing to do with quote unquote finding myself. It had to do with stripping away all of the bullshit that was keeping me from what you talked about, 1 year old me, who was this authentic expression of a human soul, and then it just
Yes.
got covered up by 20 to 30 years of conditioning, and now here we all are in our 30s and 40s operating our lives based on our conditioning versus our truth. And that's the first step, is realizing that truth is simply just a perception of truth that has been repeated over time. Dr.
Yes,
Barry.
yes, said so beautifully because it's very accurate. That's if people can just understand that, we can progress so much faster.
Yeah.
We just have to understand that the beliefs you have right now, so like historically, right, every human has believed that the beliefs they have are the most accurate beliefs,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
and they've all been wrong,
Yeah.
right? So we don't want to be foolish to think the same.
Yeah.
We want to say, I'm going to make sure that my beliefs are based on the most up to date facts, with the understanding that there are new facts coming as we continue to advance, as we continue to learn more about ourselves, as science advance, as our understanding of the world advance. We've only explored 5% of the universe. We have a lot more to
Mm-hmm.
learn. So your job is to make sure that your beliefs are founded in up to date facts. And the up
Yeah.
to date fact says that we have created these patterns simply because of these harmful beliefs, and there is no biological basis for it. Like it's just we've been doing this to ourselves. You believe
Yeah.
people are incapable of things, so then you don't teach them those things, and then they don't have those things. And that's why
Mm-hmm.
we do have men walking around that are highly emotionally intelligent. My husband is one of them, right? We're teaching my son, right? Of course, empathy and emotional intelligence. And guess what? He's soaking up that knowledge just like any human would,
Yeah.
because he can, because he has the same parts of his brain that I do.
Yeah. And so it sounds like part one is strip away everything you thought that you knew about the truth.
Please
And then part
be
two
open
is,
minded.
yeah, be open to other perceptions. And I think a big piece of that is simply, as simple as it may sound, education. Again,
Yes.
we were never
Seeking
taught
knowledge.
any of this, and nobody's ever probably going to teach you it. And so you have to take it upon yourself to be able to have a wider view, which is so much easier said than done because our mindset keeps us stuck in that narrow view. But once you begin to kind of challenge that day in and day out, right? It is not something where you just sit down and bust out your journal and do this only one time. It is a daily
No,
process, right? Of
it's a
saying,
lifestyle. Yeah.
checking in with myself with every
Mm-hmm.
decision that I'm making and saying, am I making this decision based off of a set of beliefs and values that I was conditioned for? Because that's by default what our brain wants to do because it's easier and our
Yes.
brain is all about
Yes.
efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you sit down and you say, okay, let me just open up my perception here to say what other possibilities might exist? And when you give yourself choice, you give yourself power. And when you give yourself the power to choose a different option, now all of a sudden you're more free. You give yourself the
Yes.
freedom from all of that conditioning of your past.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Dr. Barry, I know there's a lot of millennial mamas and daddas that are listening today, and what would you say to them in terms of, not only educating our kids so that they don't feel tied to our way of doing things, right? Like I always
Mm-hmm.
say to people, I'm like, what should I do to like make sure my kids don't get, my trauma? And I'm like, do two things. Make sure that they're like safe and make sure that they're happy. Everything else they're going to learn on their own. They're going to learn lessons either the hard way or they're going to learn them, because you told them so. And that's what relates to that conditioning. So, what would you say to those parents of like, how do we make sure that when we talk about breaking the chain, breaking the generational trauma, what are some ways that as parents we can be hyper aware of how we're interacting with our kids so that we're not projecting onto them?
Yes. So your kids are going to learn from what you say and also what you do. And you have to remember that.
Mm-hmm.
And what you do will more than likely trump what you say.
Mm.
So if you want your child to be empathetic, you must then model empathy. If you want your child to have good communication skills, you must model that. Anger management, model that. You have
Yeah.
like that will be more than likely what they default to because they
Yeah.
observe your behavior no different than if you pick up a brush and let's say this is their first time seeing you use a brush and you use that brush, you will, if you hand that brush to your child, what are they going to do? Do the same thing they just saw you do. But what if you were to use the brush and do this under your arm? They would do
Yeah.
that, right? Because they're modeling you. They're like, okay, this is how we use this thing. No different than if, again, if it's their first time seeing it, you say, oh, a brush is actually called a coaster. And you say, this is a coaster. They're going to start calling it a coaster. They're modeling after you because they have no
Yeah.
frame of reference. So you really have to understand the power and influence that you have. It's bigger than any influencer on social media, right? You are this little child's like world, everything. They trust everything you say and do. So even if you were to teach the wrong things, they will go along with it because they don't know any better. We are very intelligent when we
Yeah.
come into the world. We're sponges, but we also are extremely naive because we're new here. So you have to really
Hmm.
take it serious and say, how do my actions towards my child, what messages does that send? And do I also explain things and all of that? And we have to remember that kids learn the same way, or humans in general learn the same way we learn in school. Modeling, explanation over and over and over again, thorough explanation, right? Taking you to the basics and then building from there. If I want to teach you math, I have to first teach you, number recognition, then
Yeah.
teach you the value of those numbers, then how to add them or subtract. Like, right, you got to go to the basics and then build from there. I have to meet you at your level of understanding. And when you are a child, your level of understanding is zero. So whatever you think is common sense, go one under that and start there and teach your child. That
Yeah.
is how they're going to actually learn. So you have to remind yourself of that too. And then you have really just 4 jobs, and this is for all humans. All humans. You have to teach, like, of course, teach, right? And I'll get into the 3 things you have to teach. But the first thing is make sure you're loving and nurturing your child. All human
Hmm.
beings need love and to be nurtured, and they all need to have their emotional and mental needs met. Again, get out of the brainwashing that
Yeah.
boys need less than girls. That is not true. And if you need an example of that, step outside and look at the men that are walking around right now.
Yeah.
You can see that they did not get their emotional needs met. We
Yeah.
have to stop that. The men that you complain about that you went on a date with and you're like, he's so emotionally unavailable, someone didn't love him enough. He
Mm.
didn't get enough hugs. He didn't get enough kisses. He didn't have safe spaces to talk about his feelings. You don't want more men like that.
Yeah.
It starts by treating them like humans when they are little, and then you have better outcomes, right? So remember that humans all need to be loved and nurtured. And then you really 3 things, 3 major categories that you're teaching your kids. You're teaching them mental health skills. Please, people forget that. It's one of your
Yeah.
most important jobs. You got to teach them emotional intelligence, emotional regulation, right? You're teaching them social skills because they're all going to be socializing. And that means you have to teach them, these are really important: healthy conflict resolution, like how to take accountability, empathy. You have to teach those things. You teach
Yeah.
empathy through teaching perspective taking, right? Letting them know that when they do an action, how that makes you feel or someone else feel without making them responsible for your feelings, but modeling to them this behavior, like hitting when you're frustrated, makes people feel this so that they
Yeah.
can understand that's how that occurs, right? So we have mental health skills, social skills, and then lastly, life skills. Like I like to say, everybody who eats needs to know how to cook. Everybody who makes a mess needs to know how to clean. Everybody who contributes to any task needs to know how to do said task
Uh-huh.
because that's a part of being an adult.
Yeah.
It's not about a gender role. It's literally about you having independence and life skills. Because
Yeah.
if you didn't have a partner, how are you gonna, you don't know how to do your laundry or cook for yourself? That's a problem. This is why everyone needs to know how to do those things. You're teaching those things, right, while loving and nurturing them. And then they were born a whole person and they are going on a self-discovery journey, and you should be excited about that, excited about this
Yes.
mystery box that was just born into the world. And your child will have experiences just like you do and learn things about themselves, what their
Yeah.
favorite foods are, favorite color, favorite whatever, what they like to do, what they're attracted to. Those things are a lot of them are largely rooted in their biology.
Yeah.
So you're supposed to make it safe for them to discover and celebrate that,
Mm.
right? And
Yeah.
supporting that. We are not born blank slates. People thought that many, many generations ago, but science has disproven that long, long ago. So we
Yeah.
got to get out of that brainwashing. I would say you want to give birth to a doctor, you better be prepared to give birth to like 100 kids because that's not
Uh-huh.
how it works.
Yeah.
Right? Like you want to up your odds, you would have to have a lot of babies, and please don't do that. Not to be able to meet their needs. That's too many kids. But the point is, you don't get to choose if your child is a doctor.
Yeah.
Your child will tell you if they are.
Yeah,
Right. So
exactly.
you got to understand you're wasting a lot of your energy trying to treat them like a blank slate when they're not. They are a whole person that has to discover themselves. And all that time you're wasting trying to get in the way of their authentic discovery, you could have been teaching them those things I told you to be teaching them. And that's why the world is like ass backwards right now. Right. You got people who are, yes, working the job that their
Woo,
parents wanted
yeah.
them to work, but they can't even regulate their emotions. We got to stop it. Right.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. We need to do like a whole other episode on just how do you regulate your emotions because nobody ever teaches us that. But what you
This is
going
the
back to
book.
what
I
you
break
talked,
it down. I
yeah,
break
there
it
you
down in
go.
my book,
Get the
an
book.
example
Get
of
the
how to do
book.
that.
But you know what I love what you mentioned too about like, teaching your children, but the important part of that is so much of that teaching comes from the modeling. And I think a perfect example
Yes.
of that for so many millennials is that I think a lot of us have that kind of, secret resentment that like we were raised to believe that like rest is lazy and that your level of worth comes from your level of productivity and you always have to be go, go, go. And I think that so many of us millennial parents are doing such an amazing job of breaking that generational pattern. And I would just encourage y'all to ask yourself right now, like, what do you do with your kids on a Saturday morning? Right? When they wake up on a Saturday morning, is the first thing that you're doing as a family is chores, or are you spending quality time together? Are you going on a hike together? Right? It's like, it's those types of things where you can tell your kids all day, every day that rest is really important and that I want you to feel like you can always take care of yourself. But if you're not modeling that, right, like I don't know what the percentage would be in terms of what they're picking up from modeling versus what they're picking up from words, but
It's
I would venture to say that it's a much bigger percentage than
Yeah,
words.
look up conditioning. If people want to understand this more, we all need to understand it more. So hopefully people want to understand it more. Just
Yeah.
look up classical conditioning and operant conditioning and the psychology behind
Mm-hmm.
that, and you'll understand why what you're doing impacts your child more than what you're saying. But what you're saying is important. Think of the explanation as it's supposed to complement the action, right? Because if I'm new here, I'm a young child, and maybe I see my parent doing something empathetic or, compassionate to someone else, I'm witnessing that behavior, right? But I'm new here. So I still
Yeah.
need you to explain it to me. I don't, right? It's like if
Yeah.
I see you write that 2 + 2 = 4, it's like, okay, well, I see it, but I still need that explanation. So the explanation is meant to accompany and complement the action so that they can have an internal understanding. But
Yeah.
you can't do one or the other. You got to do both.
I love that. That's an amazing way of explaining it to just, yeah, put it into concrete, make it make sense.
Mhm.
Um, Dr. Barry, you talk a lot about in your book this whole idea of, so much of the healing journey is just understanding the inner workings of our mind. And as we
Yes.
begin to kind of wrap things up here today, I'm curious to hear from you of like, what would you say if you were to just pick one thing, right? Like, what is the one most important thing that we can understand about our minds and how we operate as humans that can help us to go on this healing journey maybe more easily, I guess?
Yeah. So I would say that, and I always say this, psychology is the cheat code to life. So you know how you play
Mm,
video games and back in the day we used to put in the cheat codes and then it would unlock stuff? That's what psychology is.
yeah.
Without it, you do not have a deep enough understanding of yourself or others to root yourself in. So that means that you're having experiences without having language to real or even more than just language, but even just understanding to really make sense of what's going on here. So it's
Hmm.
kind of like if I taught you that these creatures are called animals, but I refuse to teach you their individual names. I'm going to
Mm,
take you to the zoo, right? And you're going to go, that's an animal, that's an animal, that's an animal, and you would be right,
yeah.
right? So you're going to be like, That's a toxic behavior, I think. That's a toxic behavior, I think. That's a toxic behavior, I think.
Uh-huh.
That's not as valuable as being able to say, well, that's an elephant, that's a lion, that's a this, or that's manipulation, that's confirmation bias, that's gaslighting. Like that's more valuable.
Yeah.
So when you study psychology, that is what happens for you. It unlocks, and I always say, once it's unlocked, you can't right, can't go back. Right, once you have the
Uh-huh.
knowledge, just like today, you can name animals without really thinking because you just know them so well. Psychology is the study of us. We
Yeah.
all need this knowledge. We all need to care about it because it is what's going to help you understand yourself and others. So
Mm-hmm.
that's really what we all need to understand is like the key to unlocking your mind is really diving into it through psychology. Psychology exists
Yeah.
so that we can understand ourselves. And I think that that's what, if this whole thing is, being on earth is a school, as people say, and for souls, and we're supposed to be figuring things out. I think what we're supposed to be figuring out is that the thing that we've been convincing ourselves doesn't matter actually matters more than anything else. Isn't that the joke's on us, right? Your
Yeah.
mental health,
Oh,
you've been told it doesn't
yeah.
matter. And it's no, it's literally everything. It's your brain. And it,
Yeah.
it affects
It's
the whole world.
it's like I think about it like this, right? It's like your brain is just a big old living, breathing computer, and psychology is the coding guide.
Oh my gosh, yes.
You can take that,
I
yeah.
love that. I love that. Yes. Love it. And it's spot on and accurate.
Speaking of though, using psychology as a coding guide and really digging into like learning about this, let's talk about your book because recently launched. It is Bold, Black, and Becoming, a psychology guide to heal and thrive. Give us a little bit of insight, a little quick preview of what listeners can expect when reading your book, and then we'll tell them where they can get it.
Yes, absolutely. So it's basically what we were just talking about, right? This book is meant to kind of help you start getting that cheat code and understanding your mind's programming. Now, of course, there's no way to write one book with all psychology in it. The book would
Yeah.
be ridiculously long, but this is a great starting point, especially if you know little about psychology or how you're brain, even if you know a lot. Like I go into so much depth about certain topics that even if you know what they are, you might learn some new aspects to understanding them that just help you become better at being mindful of them, using them to your advantage, and responding to them in a healthy way. So there is that, right? And so like I do want to, I always want to explain this to people because I don't want people to be like, does this mean I can't read this if I'm not Black? No, it's not what it means. So this book was written in honor of Black mental health because there is still a lot of stigma, like, and of course there's stigma across all groups of people, but there's a lot of stigma within Black community. So it was really important to me for my first book to just be attractive to the Black community.
Yeah.
Right? They're like, oh, a Black doctor wrote this, maybe I should read it so that people can start learning that your emotions do not make you weak, they make you human. And here's what you can do to start working with your emotions, your thoughts, your behaviors in a healthier way. But psychology applies to all of us,
Yeah.
everybody. So this book, 96 to 97% of what's in this book is actually skills, tips, psychoeducation that applies to everybody. And then the
Mm-hmm.
other 3 to 4% is about some statistics around Black mental health and things like that I think is also important for everyone to know, right? We need to have empathy for each other and our experiences. And
Yeah.
I always say our suffering as well as our successes are not meant to be a source of competition. They are meant to be a source of empathy. So
Ooh,
it's
that's
important that
good.
everyone know about this as well. Yes, everything that's in this book, you will get the same value as anybody else reading it because you're human. And
Yeah.
this is for humans at the end of the day.
Yeah. So good. Y'all
Mm-hmm.
make sure you get on Amazon, grab it while it lasts. Bold, Black, and Becoming by Dr. Abina Berry.
Yes.
And also, Dr. Berry, let them know where they can find you on TikTok.
Yeah, you just search at Dr. Berry psychologist and you'll be able to find me. Also, if you end up getting my book, I have all of my social media handles on the back
Oh,
for
nice.
for TikTok, for Facebook, Instagram, and even YouTube. Haven't started posting on YouTube yet, but I will soon. So please go follow and subscribe there because I will be utilizing that space for longer content and teaching things very soon. But yeah, so the TikTok is the best place to find me first, and then you can just click my link tree that's in my bio, and it takes you to everything else. That's the easiest way. So at Dr.
Awesome.
Berry Psychologist.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely. Y'all go check her out. I'm telling you, I'm not kidding you when I say it's like free therapy. So yeah, Dr. Berry, thank you once again so much for coming on. Every
Thank you.
time that we talk, you open up new perceptions in my own brain as well. So I'm just so appreciative of your insight and your expertise and just the way that you explain things. I hope you all listening have found this just as helpful as I have today. If you like what you heard, be sure to follow, subscribe, share with all your millennial besties that need to hear this message today. You can always check out the website too, www.themillennialreset.com, to subscribe to the podcast letter, find more resources for support. But in the meantime, my besties, heal on, heal on.